All right, hello everyone. You start, we good? All right, perfect timing, yeah. Welcome back everyone, hope we had a nice weekend. Let's see, this should be turning on any second, hopefully they get this thing right. Okay, welcome back, hope we had a nice weekend. Anyone have any questions about what we covered last week about the Constitution? Or about Marbury? Or about anything like that? Ooh, that's interesting. Huh. Hopefully that goes away. English. Any questions about that? No? All right, so far what have we covered in this class, right? We've covered the Constitution, and we've covered the courts, and how the courts are able to, that's really annoying. Let's see that. Nope, didn't help. Okay, so just it's really annoying. Okay, I'll be right back. I have to call them. I don't know why this is. That one. Yeah, I know it's actually the projector, which is really annoying. Okay. I hate doing this. But that's gonna be really annoying the entire class.
Replace one coil with a fuel injector. This one is either the fuel pressure regulator or those ones. The fuel pressure regulator, which is So it tells you only on what. So just when you this one.
See? Okay, anyway. Where was I? So our discussion today, everyone settle down. Okay, so our discussion today is going to be focusing on what's probably the most important aspect of the Constitution. And I think I mentioned this before, but the answer is not the Bill of Rights. The answer is not the First Amendment. The answer is not the 14th Amendment. The most important aspect of the Bill of Rights is the separation of powers. And the reason why the separation of powers is so important is because of what Madison wrote in Federalist Number 51. That the only way to oppress, the only way to stop, the only way to check power is with more power. Or as Madison wrote, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. And our Constitution does this in a very delicate but bold way by dividing the powers up among the three branches. And by now you should know Article 1. What's Article 1? Congress. What's Article 2?
President.
Executive, the President. What's Article 3? The courts. 1, 2, 3. Have those cold in your mind. Each branch checks every other branch. So where did I finish last time? Back up top. Is that Jessica?
It's Kara.
Oh, okay, you're Kara. Jessica's not there? Okay, so Kara. Kara, give me some of the ways that Congress can check the executive. And these are in your book, but just discuss. What's some of the ways that Congress can check the executive? Good, right? And then what happens if the president overrides? No, sorry, you said it backwards. You were right. How can Congress check the president?
I guess they can override. He can veto, they can override.
Exactly. If the president decides to veto a bill, 2/3 of Congress can override it, right? Is that Walter?
Yes.
Walter, what's another way that Congress can check the executive? What's the most fundamental way, the one we discussed last week in Federal 78? What's the most fundamental way that Congress can check the executive, more than overriding the veto?
Congress can deny the president's,
What does the president need to do anything? What do all of us need?
the funding.
Exactly. The power of the purse, right? The most important tool that Congress has is the power of the purse. They can defund if they don't like it. And appropriations last 2 years, so they don't like what the president's doing, they can cut them out. Steve, what else can what else can Congress do to check the executive? Okay, and then if the president doesn't like it, he vetoes it? Okay, that was said before. What else? What else? What other role does the Congress, the Senate in particular, have over the executive's agenda? Mhm. Specifically, what does the Senate? Do you have it? Is that Mark? What can the Senate do to check the executive, specifically the Senate?
What can the Senate? The Senate, I guess maybe it's the same thing, but if the president wants to do something within from a bill standpoint, he wants some sort of legislation, the Senate can then not.
Let's move beyond legislation. What other things does the president need the Senate to sign off on?
His appointment.
Exactly, right? If the president wants to appoint a Secretary of State, a Secretary of Defense, a Secretary of whatever, who has to approve it?
The Senate.
Exactly. Good. Yvette, what else does the Senate have to sign off on? Other than appointments, what else? What? Good. Declaration of war. Exactly, right? It wasn't what I was looking for. That's the right answer, right? Under our Constitution, the president needs Congress to declare war. That isn't probably true, okay? I know I just said it, but under our current law, it's understood that the president needs a declaration of war. The better argument is probably that war was a state that Congress would declare, but it wasn't actually necessary, right? The same way say, oh, we're in times of war or times of peace. Congress merely declared what time we were in, but the president had the power to independently as long as it was funded, right? Aaron, what's one thing that the Senate must sign off on other than appointments?
Treaties.
Treaties, right? If you want to make international relations, you need 2/3 vote from the Senate, okay? So you see there are lots of ways that Congress can check the executive. Johnny, how can Congress check the judiciary, the courts? They can impeach, damn straight, yeah. If a judge misbehaves, they can throw the bum out, right? Naquanda, what else? What else can the Congress do to check the courts? Even before impeachment, how can Congress have a say on the judiciary? One at a time, one at a time. Think about it. How were judges appointed? How did, what?
Lifetime.
Any judge, any federal judge. How do federal judges get there?
They're appointed
By whom?
by the president.
And then what happens?
It's all heard.
No, they don't start work. What's happened before they can start work?
They take the oath.
No. Which branch of government has a say over federal judges? Go look at your Constitution, right? Here. It's not cheating. Take it out. Okay. Right. It's yeah. Article 2, Section 2. Go to page 13. All right, I want to read the last paragraph. It says, "He shall have power," on page 13. You have your Constitution?
I don't.
Okay, look on with her. Please bring it to class. It's really light. Doesn't take up much room. So page 13, the last paragraph. He shall have power. Read it, please.
Shall have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, providing 2/3 of the senators present first.
Okay, good. We said 2/3 vote for a Senate treaty. Okay, keep reading.
Shall nominate and power of the officers of the United
Okay, and stop there, okay? So how does a judge become a judge? You just read it.
States. The vice president of the Senate,
What does that mean?
they vote.
Yes. The president nominates a judge, and the Senate votes on it. And Aquana, what happens if the Senate votes no on a judge?
They can't do it.
Done. So one of the biggest checks Congress has over the judiciary is they get to decide who goes on. Now, they get to vote once. And usually that's it, right? Because they have lifetime tenure. They do have that check. Also, one other aspect we discussed last week, right, is jurisdiction. What if Congress takes away a court's jurisdiction? They can't decide cases without jurisdiction. Okay? All right. And we already discussed it, but how can the president check Congress? By vetoing bills. Right? So what you see here is every single branch checks the other branch. In our government, you can't take one step by yourself. Virtually any act of any significance in our government requires at least two branches to concur, whether it's appointing judges, passing bills, appointing officers, ratifying treaties. No one can act alone. And our Constitution reflects that. You cannot act alone. Okay? But what happens when a president acts alone? And this brings us to the case we'll discuss today, which is probably, and I don't say this lightly, the most important case of the 20th century. Not Obamacare, oh, that's just 21st century, right? The most important case probably in the last 150 years. Not Obamacare, not gay marriage, no. This case, Youngstown Sheet Tube Company versus Sawyer, was one of those significant cases of all time. Okay? The reason why should become obvious in a few moments. But for a preview, the court told a sitting president at the time of war, no, you cannot do that. I want you to keep in your mind today how significant that was. And how easy it would have been for President Truman to say, no, I'm going to do it anyway. How easy it would have been to just ignore that. All right? So for background, I presume none of you have studied American history because many of you probably haven't. It's actually a tragedy in our school system today. But we had a war in Korea from 1950 to roughly 1953, depending how you count. Okay? Why were we in war with Korea? We don't really know why. But for better or worse, this was an extension of the Cold War, where the United States was backing South Korea, or we now know as South Korea, and the Soviet Union was supporting the North. So did anyone see the movie The Interview? Be a good American to go watch the movie, right? I saw the day it came out. I liked it, actually. People hated it. I thought it was pretty good. I thought it was funny. But the reason why Korea has that line in the middle and basically the country is divided in half is because of this war. Now, at the height of this war, the United States sent over 300,000 Americans to this war. Okay? This was a very bloody, dangerous war that really didn't provide many gains for the United States other than the impact on the Cold War. So what happened with Youngstown? If I can, I'll show you some pictures. I love showing pictures because I helps visualize this. Okay. This is the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company factory in Youngstown, Ohio. Okay. So as you can imagine, during war, a lot of American industry was mobilized to support the military. And it may not surprise you, but a key ingredient in any sort of military venture is steel. You need it for weapons, for tanks, for planes, for ammunition. Okay. During the height of the Korean War, there was a massive labor dispute in the United States. The steel workers threatened to go on strike. The steel mill owners refused to negotiate and said, fine, go ahead, go on strike. What do we care? The president determined that if these workers went on strike, it would directly impede the war effort, and we would not be able to provide the necessary supplies for our troops in the field. So although this case was domestic, it had severe implications overseas for our troops abroad. So what happened here is actually crazy. They should make a movie about this, how dramatic it was. So on April 9th, the strike was about to begin. Okay? On April 8th, the night before, President Truman issued Executive Order 10340. Okay? Executive Order 10340 did a number of things, but primarily it seized, took over every steel mill in the country. That's why it's often called the steel seizure case, because they seized the steel mills. The president seized every steel mill in the country and turned it over to the Secretary of Commerce, Thomas Sawyer. Anyone wondering why it's versus Sawyer? Yeah, Sawyer was the Secretary of Commerce. What does it mean to hand over a factory to a government official? Well, I'll tell you one thing. If the workers had gone on strike, what do you think would have happened to them? They would have been arrested. So usually when a worker goes on strike and works off the job, flashes a sign, whatever, right? He has a right to protest. No one's obligated to work for anyone. But if the government seized that steel mill, the workers would then be obligated by law to work for the Secretary of Commerce. They throw them in jail. And what happens if any of the managers of the plants quit, saying, I'm not working for you? Jail. So basically you put a bunch of military officials inside a U.S. steel mill, and you require at the point of a gun that these men continue working and pumping out steel. This was not a light effort. And at the time, throughout the world, the spread of socialism was creeping. And it was not uncommon for communist countries to start seizing industries, citing national emergencies. This was not even, 6 years after World War II ended, 7 years after World War II ended, where the threat of fascism basically conquered all industries and put under the arm of the state. And here you had President Harry Truman acting on his own through an executive order, taking over an entire industry. And this wasn't for a limited duration. It didn't say for the next 72 hours till the strike settles. It was indefinitely until I say otherwise. Okay? Truman sent this message the very next day to Congress and said, hey, Congress, guess what I did yesterday, right? What did my first day of school? I seized the steel mills, right? I don't need your permission. If you'd like to support me, that'd be cool, but I don't need you because I can do it myself. He wrote, the Congress can, if it wishes, reject the course of action, but you guys haven't done anything. So he tells Congress, 1 day passes, 2 days passes, 12 days pass and Congress says nothing. What do we make of that? Where Congress takes no action whatsoever to reject what the president does. Does that mean they support it? Does it even matter if they support it? Can the president act like this even if Congress says you can? I'm not asking the questions, rhetoric. I'm building up to it. Come on. So the lawsuit begins, right? Didn't I tell you last week that these sorts of political questions are usually not brought to the courts, right? Why is this question in the courts? Well, the owner of this factory had an interest, right? His factory, and here's actually a modern day picture of it. His factory was just seized. You'll study this in property, but what happens if the government takes your property? What do they have to do? Did he get paid? Nope. So he says, wait a minute. The government just seized my property. I didn't get a nickel. Right? I'm going to go to sue. So and this is actually crazy, right? The lawyers for the steel mill found the district judge in his home that evening. They basically pulled him out of bed and said, we need to be in court tomorrow. And they scheduled a hearing for the next morning at like 9 a.m. The judge, who will be not known to history, but played a role of such significance, granted a preliminary injunction. Everyone know what that is? It's like a temporary restraining order, if you know what that is. An order telling the secretary, you cannot seize this steel mill. Can you imagine the guts of that judge to, in the middle of a war, to tell the president, you cannot do that? His name will be lost to history. But had that judge held, what are you talking about? The president can do what he wants. This case would have never happened. And I think our country would be a very, very different place. After 2 days, the judge ruled against President Truman. This case went immediately on appeal. And the appeals court said, wait a minute, let's not waste our time here, right? We'll put this on hold if you go to the Supreme Court right away. So this case went from the district court to Supreme Court in about like 12 days. District judge opinion, April 30th. It was argued for the Supreme Court on May 12th. Can you imagine, in 12 days, the case going from beginning to Supreme Court? And you want to know something more? The Supreme Court resolved it in about 21 days. That's one of the reasons why there's so many opinions, because they couldn't get any unanimity. They just get, all right, let's write whatever, we'll worry about the details later. So this case was racing up the Supreme Court. And the generals and the government officials basically said to the court, if you rule against us, our men will die. If you rule against us and let this steel strike go on, we will have casualties because we cannot provide our troops with the requisite supplies. Imagine you're a judge sitting there and the government tells you, if you rule against us, people will die. A very similar message was spoken about 10 years earlier in a case called Korematsu. We'll say this later, where the executive said, if we do not detain these Japanese Americans, Americans will be at risk of dying. By the way, whenever the government says, if you do X, people will die, a little skeptical. We'll talk about a couple of instances. They often lie about these sorts of things. As it turns out, after this case resolved, the steel strike went for 50 days, and everything was actually okay. So, but we don't know that yet, right? Hindsight's 20/20. So this case goes to Supreme Court. In, again, what I think is probably the most significant separation of powers decision in at least the last 150 years. And what does the court do? By a vote of 6-3, it wasn't unanimous. By a vote of 6-3, the court tells President Truman, no, you cannot do this. Our Constitution is built on the checks and balances and separation of powers. You cannot act alone by issuing Executive Order 10340. That's the easy holding of the case. But what I want you to gather and digest is how each of the justices approached this issue. Because each of the justices had a very distinct narrative of why the government loses. Oh, this is Charles Sawyer, the Secretary of Commerce. So let's first start with Justice Hugo Black. And I often like to discuss the justices because their personalities are very much instrumental to who they are. So Justice Black was a senator from Alabama, and he was appointed by Franklin Roosevelt, one of many that were appointed by Roosevelt. And Black's reputation was perhaps most marred by the fact that he was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And it's a fascinating story. It wasn't revealed that he was in the Klan until after he was appointed to the court. Somehow, before the internet, that kind of slipped by. And he claimed, well, you know, to be an Alabama politician in the 1930s, you had to be a member of the Klan. Okay, take it for what it's worth. Actually, a funny story. So the very first day that he appeared on the bench, some member of the bar stood up and said, Mr. Chief Justice, you cannot seat Justice Black from the court. And they actually filed a complaint against him. It was dismissed. But Justice Black went on to serve an almost 35-year career where he developed a steep appreciation for the text of the Constitution. His most famous contribution to the law was this. The First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. He says, no law means no law. He would rule again in every single First Amendment case against the law. There were a lot of actually obscenity cases. And believe it or not, the Supreme Court actually had a movie theater where they would screen all these pornos. I'm not joking, right? They would actually screen all these movies, say, is this obscene? Justice Black refused to watch them, saying, they're all constitutional. You can't ban any of it. It's all speech. Because no meant no. But this doctrinal textualism bleeds into his analysis. Okay? Because how he approaches the Constitution is very much grounded in the text. So, okay. Amanda, what is Justice Black's approach to the separation of powers in this case?
As far as the president making his own decisions despite the Congress law, I understand the whole decision of powers.
What does Justice Black say? Describe his opinion for me, please. By the way, Justice Black is the majority opinion, although it's not the one that's most remembered. What's Justice Black's opinion? Describe it for me. What does he look to decide this case?
Well, I know the reason for why they wanted to see this.
What does he cite? What are his reasonings in his opinion?
Quite scattered with a lot of material.
It's not scattered. Black's opinion is actually fairly straightforward. So the other one's a little scattered. Black's is pretty straightforward. Sophia, you want to give it a go? The text of the Constitution, right? He actually focuses almost exclusively on the text of the Constitution. This is in distinction with Jackson. We'll get to Jackson in a little bit, right? Sophia, what does Black look to in the text of the Constitution that's so significant?
The president's not amending to issue the order must stand either from an act of Congress or from the Constitution itself.
Uh-huh. Okay, so let's stop there for a second. You're exactly right. What Black says is, for any action the president takes, right, the authority can come from one of two places. It can come from a statute, right? Congress can pass a statute and give the president authority. And if it doesn't come from the statute, Sophia, where does it must come from? The Constitution, right? Those are the only two places where authority can come from the executive. Sophia, does Justice Black believe in some sort of undefined, unenumerated powers that come from, the wherever? No. He's very much a textualist. No means no. Separation of powers means separation of powers, right? Okay, so Janine, is there any statute here that gives the president the power to take over the steel mills? Is there any statute?
There's not, but he makes reference to the
Taft-Hartley. If you flipped it, Taft-Hartley.
Hartley.
And what did that do?
That was in a time when Congress did take over. No, Congress rejected
Good.
the seizure of there was another collective bargaining agreement, another labor dispute, and Congress did not want to act in that.
Exactly right. So here's what happened, right? Labor disputes aren't new. War isn't new. The country had just spent 7 years in a world war, right? We had a number of labor problems. Congress and the president knew what would happen if an industry went on strike during a war, right? This wasn't a surprise. And the previous president, a guy named Roosevelt, right, or I think it's probably still Truman at that point, asked Congress, hey, can you guys give me the power to seize an industry to avert a labor strike? So the president asked for this power. Did Congress give it to him? No. They didn't just not give it to him. They said, no, you do not have that power. If you want to seize an industry, you come to us first, right? You have to get permission from us, and we'll take it. Because which branch of government you need can take property? Which branch of government can seize property?
The executive? No, the Congress.
The legislative branch, right? If Congress wanted to, as horrible as it sounds, they could have seized the entire industry by passing a statute. But the president cannot do so alone. And the president didn't contest this, right? So is that Cameron? Cameron. So if there's no statute providing the authority to President Truman to do this, where does he have to get the authority from? Congress gave him nothing. So if Congress did not give him any authority, where does this power must come from?
Oh, from the Constitution.
From the Constitution, exactly. Cameron, which clauses of the Constitution does Justice Black cite as potential grants of authority?
I know he mentioned Article 2 just to emphasize exactly what the president has.
Right, no, Article 2, you're in the right place. Which parts of Article 2? He cites 3 specific provisions. There are 3 provisions of Article 2 that are cited that maybe could give the president the authority necessary to act alone. Here we go, Roy.
Yes, sir. Particular reliance is placed on provisions in Article 2 which say that the executive power shall be vested in the president. They should take care that the laws be faithfully executed. I think that was the main one. And then he shall be commander in chief of the Army and Navy of the United States.
Very good. And in case you want the cheat, have them on the board, okay? I was hoping you would have noticed that. I was like, how do I hide that? Anyway, so there are 3 provisions of the Constitution that Justice Black says maybe could give the president the authority to act here. So Article 2, Section 1, the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States. Nikolai, what do we get from that provision? Why would that give the president authority? What about that text does it?
What the question I need to
How can President Truman look to this provision of the Constitution to get power to seize the steel mills?
Well, you can say, no, we're in wartime.
Read it again. Read it again. What does it say?
It says that the executive power should be vested in the President of the United States of America.
What does that mean? Go word by word.
He's the head of the executive.
What is the executive power?
The executive power is how to put it, the power where you have the legislative power making the laws, and then the executive power is the one performing.
Good.
the laws.
So Nikolai, does the Constitution define the executive power?
No.
No, it doesn't. So maybe the lawyers for President Truman, imagine that you guys are a lawyer for the Justice Department, right? That's defend this case. says, well, you know what? The Constitution doesn't define executive power. We're going to say the executive powers includes the powers of seizing steel mills. You can make that argument. All right? Does that argument work, Toshiba?
No.
How come?
Because then you read on to section 2, it starts to say what he has.
Ah. So what do we get, Toshiba? Let me ask you this follow-up, please. If they say there's this broad executive power, and then they start to find all these special instances, okay, commander of the chief, right, in the Army and Navy, do this, that. How do we understand it when they have a broad definition and these very narrow sub-definitions? What's that mean? You're on the right track.
I think they go on and talk about enumerated.
Good.
Endorsements, so for Congress, that they enumerated and unenumerated powers.
Good.
And so when they start enumerating, listing them, it cancels out.
It narrows, right?
Narrows, yeah.
In other words, executive power can't mean whatever the president wants it to mean. The reasons Toshiba just identified. There are specific instances. Commander-in-Chief of the Army, of the Navy. He can do this, he can do that. In other words, the president can't do whatever he damn well pleases, right? It's a narrowing of the powers of the president. Okay, so you got the first two. Jennifer, right? Jennifer, this last provision. Read it for me, please.
You shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed.
We'll spend a lot of time on this clause because it's been extremely salient in the last 6 or 7 years. What does this mean, Jennifer, this provision?
That the laws that exist, he's the one to make sure that people
And who makes the laws?
not the legislature.
Ah, so you shall take care that the laws are faithfully executed, right? Are there any laws here that Congress passes executing? No. Remember we said a minute ago, right? Congress did not pass a statute here. So are there any laws he can possibly be executing, Jennifer?
Not
Exactly right. Okay. So we have here section 3. Go back to section 2 for a second. Is that Elizabeth? Elizabeth, does Justice Black think that seizing a steel mill in Ohio is performing the duties of the commander-in-chief of the military? How? Louder, please. I didn't hear you.
It says it's not a military command, there's no crisis, and he violated the separation of powers by passing Congress.
Very good. There's no doubt that there's some sort of military effort overseas in Korea, right? But we're talking about Ohio here, right? Middle of America. You cannot use your war powers over domestic territory. Now, this is a theme that's actually not entirely clear. So during World War II, we'll do the Korematsu case in a couple weeks, the president used his war powers over California. He said California was a war zone. It was a front against the Japanese attack, and we could use it to seize Japanese and put them in concentration camps. Similarly, President Lincoln, okay, this one's going to blow your minds. Ready for this one? I'm sure everyone's heard of the Emancipation Proclamation, right? Right, it freed the slaves, okay? Well, they actually freed the slaves in the North. But do you know how Lincoln freed the slaves? Ready for this? He effectively said the northern states and southern states were in a state of war. And under his war powers, he could seize property. Slaves. Lincoln's freeing of the slaves was actually seizing them and then immediately letting them go free. Does that blow your mind or what? The only way Lincoln could purport to free slaves was first by seizing them as property and then letting them go. The exact power here that Truman tried to invoke to take the steel mills in a time of war is what Lincoln did to free the slaves. Only in the North, though, not in the South. I'm sorry, only in the South, not the, flipped it. Only in the South, not the North, because the rebel territories were in a state of war. Blow your mind, right? So there was a history of presidents using the power to seize property during times of war. But there's no question that Ohio was not in a state of war, as the southern states were, and perhaps California and the West Coast was during World War II and the front against Japan. Any questions on this so far?
I have a quick question.
Go for it.
If Ohio's not in a state of war, they're producing the steel for the war effort, or a substantial part of it.
Uh-huh.
Would the war have to get more desperate at some point for Congress to step up and say, hey, we'll take it? Because I can see.
Well, Congress can, and that's not in doubt. If Congress the very next day said, we're going to take the steel mill, done, no question whatsoever. They don't even need a war. Congress does not even need a war for it to happen. Now, what the dissent says is they are in war. The entire United States is in a front on this war, right? The dissent says we're all in war. We can't separate this out. If we don't produce steel in Ohio, our boys in Korea can get shot at. Yeah.
So the distinguishing factor is the fact that the war wasn't on the home front; it was someplace else.
Yes, and this is some of a side note, but if you notice Justice Jackson saying that and Justice Douglas saying this war was not legitimate, there's no declaration. If you notice they said this is based on the United Nations, right? There was basically a UN resolution to go into Korea. It's almost Iraq. No, deja vu, right? To go into Korea. Nuri?
How much of a factor is it, or do you think that public policy or public mood played about this? Because I would imagine if this was 1950 when the honeymoon initial part of the war began, because our policy was contained against the Soviet Union. It was a huge factor to go into Korea. So a lot of people at this time didn't want to be in war anymore. If this was happening maybe a year and a half prior, do you think the judge would have ruled the same way?
Very good question. So let me answer it like this. These were all basically Roosevelt appointees, and they had basically all voted in Korematsu to uphold the detention. And many of them actually regretted it significantly. So I think what you're seeing here in part is saying, wait a minute, this stuff is going too far, right? We have all these fascist dictators rising on the continent. Let's not let this happen. This is Justice Jackson's position. We'll get to in a minute. All right, any other questions on Black? He has a very categorical approach. Article 1, Article 2, Article 3, if it's not one of these clauses, that means the president loses, right? It's very, very textualist, right? The second judge who I want to talk about is Justice Felix Frankfurter. He was very well-respected Harvard law professor. And he was very, very much into judicial restraint. He didn't want to go any further than he needed to. So although he ruled that the seizure was unconstitutional, he had a very, very narrow perspective, right? What did, is that Andrew?
Yes, sir.
What did Justice Frankfurter say? What was his opinion about?
His opinion was the president can act in the absence of a congressional statute or express constitutional text, but only if history suggests that it is permissible to do so.
Okay, good. So we have here a different element, right? Andrew, did Justice Black say anything about history or practice?
Yes.
Black.
Oh, no, not Black.
Black said text of the Constitution, period, right? What did Justice Frankfurter say here?
To look back towards history.
What's the value of practice, Andrew?
It shows that consistency had
Good. Good. So is that Clint? Clint, what happens if many presidents tend to do the exact same thing and no courts ever weighed in on it? What's that tell you?
That there's a custom and a precedent for it.
Yeah.
That's followed.
The idea is if people keep doing something for a very long time and no one raises any objections, even if this Constitution isn't clear, it's probably okay, right? Where else did we hear that argument for today's reading? Anyone? Where else did we hear that exact same argument that something's been done for a long time, it's probably okay?
The bank,
The bank. Why?
because at the time of that case, I forget the year, but the bank had already been in place. for
Exactly.
20 years.
Exactly. So in executive power, separation of powers cases, there's usually not a very clear line anywhere. But if many presidents have done this before, it's probably okay. So Iris, does Justice Frankfurter see a pattern of this being done a lot of times before?
Yes, at least 16 times.
Frankfurter,
Oh, I'm sorry, what was your question?
you're right for the dissent. Does Justice Frankfurter see this happening quite a lot? No, he doesn't. He says this has maybe happened a couple other times, but since there's not this long pattern, we can't say that Congress has acquiesced to this behavior, right? Iris, what does that mean for Congress to acquiesce? What does that mean? Exactly. I like how you phrased it. If the president keeps doing something that's probably wrong and Congress has nothing to stop it, can we say that Congress is okay with it? That's what we call acquiescence, right? You're not quite approving of it, but giving in. Because in this case, is that Taylor?
Yes.
Taylor, President Truman told Congress what he was doing, right? President Truman told Congress he was going to take the steel mills, right?
Yes.
Did Congress take any steps whatsoever to stop him?
No, they didn't do anything.
So what do we take from that?
Well, you could take that they were agreeing
Or,
by being silent and not acting against it,
Or-
or that they didn't approve of what he was doing.
how do we know which one it is?
We don't know.
So this is like silence, right? Remember in contracts you had acceptance by silence? Remember this? You're not really sure one way or the other. Well, President said, hey, I'm doing this. And Congress says nothing. They don't say yes, they don't say no, they say nothing. How do we read this? So Justice Frankfurter says, maybe if there's a long enough pattern, not like, a couple weeks, but many times, you can read that as an indication that Congress approves. Okay? Any other questions on Frankfurter? It was very cute. His law clerks were called the hot dogs. Frankfurter? There it is, okay. The next justice was crazy. I don't say it lightly, but Justice William O. Douglas was insane. This was a guy who considered running for the presidency while he was a justice. He had all these high ambitions. He had ironically enough, he had several wives, not at once, but he was divorced several times. At the time, the fact that he was divorced rendered him ineligible for office for the presidency. My times have come, right? Justice Douglas had a thing for marrying his secretaries, and when he got old, he married his younger secretaries. So he was kind of crazy. Also, he had a very, very bold view of judicial power. One of the more egregious things this man ever did was someone actually filed a court challenge saying that bombing in Cambodia was illegal, right? A trial judge actually ruled in favor and said the United States government has to stop their bombing runs in Cambodia, right? A judge says stop bombing. So the government appealed to the Supreme Court, and Justice Thurgood Marshall, no crazy conservative, said, are you insane? Put this ruling on hold. You are nuts, right? So what did the lawyers do? They tracked down Justice Douglas, who was in his cottage in the middle of the Washington Mountains. And he independently signed an order telling the U.S. government to stop bombing Cambodia. And he said, it's not possible to get all the justices together to consider this. I'll do this on my own. Within a couple of hours, the entire court reversed him. Okay? Dude was nuts. Okay? So what did Justice Douglas say? Is that Bridget? What did Justice Douglas say?
That it was important to keep the power within Congress because what he was doing right now might not be a big thing, but in the future it could be something else.
Exactly. This is a classic slippery slope argument, right? It's like, well, you know what? Here it's not that bad. He's seizing the steel mills, to save, the strike. But what happens if some other dictator we don't like uses his executive power in a manner we don't like? Right? What happens if some future president decides to seize, something else? We'll talk a lot in this class with President Obama's executive action immigration. I spent significant time working on this case. But shortly before it was announced, I was on the PBS NewsHour doing an interview. And, that someone opposed to me who was saying, oh, there's not a big deal if President Obama can do this. And I said to the host, well, what happens if, I don't know, say President Ted Cruz one day decides not to enforce environmental laws, right? Decide to stop admitting people to this country, right? What happens if presidents you don't like stop enforcing laws? And the host was like, oh, right? There's this look on his face like, oh my God. And I always want you to think, if President X does something, right? Imagine President Y, who you don't like, doing the exact same thing in reverse. And if you're uncomfortable with that, check your instincts, right? You should have to be able to justify whatever president using this power going forward. There will always be emergencies. There will always be times where things are urgent. We need to stop this now, right? So imagine a president you don't like using the exact same authority, and then ask yourself how things go. Okay? So Douglas actually has a fair point there, right? The mere fact they have an emergency doesn't justify. I was giving a class where I can't remember where it was, and it was a lecture. I don't remember. It was a lecture somewhere. And some students said, well, doesn't the Constitution justify the president taking emergency actions? And I was like, no, there is no emergency clause, right? The president cannot suspend the Constitution in times of crisis. In fact, the Constitution says in case of rebellion, the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended by Congress. The president can't waive laws during times of national crisis, although he may try. Okay, any other questions on William O. Douglas? Like a jerk, doesn't he? So the most important opinion from Youngstown was not even the majority. The most important opinion was by this man, Robert H. Jackson, who is considered by myself and many to be one of the greatest justices of the 20th century, and very likely probably the greatest writers on the court. Wasn't his opinion good to read? So, please not judge. Yes, it was amazing. The way he writes is just so beautiful. Most legal writing you read is crap. I don't say that lightly, right? Most of the opinions in your property or torts casebook, it's terrible. It reads poorly. This man could write. There are some people in the court better than us in writing. Scalia is a great writer. Roberts is a great writer. Kagan's a great writer. Not all of them are equally gifted, okay? Jackson. Jackson can write. And Jackson was a remarkable man. He grew up in New York. He never graduated law school. You didn't have to back then. He went, I think, for a couple of years to Albany. He never graduated. He worked in government. He rose to the ranks of the Solicitor General, the top lawyer of the U.S. government, argued for the Supreme Court. He then was appointed Attorney General of the United States. So he had extensive experience as an executive branch lawyer, right? He knew what it was like when the president said, hey, can I do this? And what that meant to give advice of whether you can do it or not. I mean, that's a tough question. When you're a government lawyer and your president asks you, hey, can I do this, right? Is the answer always, yes, sir? Or do you have an ethical obligation to the Constitution above all else? And how much can you twist the law and bend and make arguments to get there to give them that authority? Jackson also had an amazing honor. He was the chief prosecutor at Nuremberg. Nuremberg was the trials for the Nazis. So after the close of World War II, many of the Nazis were captured and they were put on trial. And Justice Jackson remarkably took a break from the Supreme Court. Imagine this, taking off a couple of years in the Supreme Court to go prosecute some Nazis, right? He was a remarkable lawyer and a brilliant jurist. Also this term, he had a law clerk. His law clerk's name was William Rehnquist, who became the Chief Justice of the United States. So what the funniest part is Justice Rehnquist didn't like him very much. And Justice Rehnquist wrote a memo saying that his opinion in Youngstown was terrible. He shouldn't issue it, right? He disagreed with him entirely. So one other funny note, though. So we'll study a case in a couple weeks called Dames and Moore versus Regan. Okay, it's a separation of powers case authored by Chief Justice Rehnquist. That term, Rehnquist law clerk, young pup named John Roberts. Yes, the Chief Justice. So you have the lineage, right? William Rehnquist clerked for Jackson, okay, and John Roberts clerked for Rehnquist. And between the three of them, they decided the most important separation of powers cases in the last 60 years. Anyway, history is fun like that. But the reason why Jackson's opinion is so significant is that he departs from black, right? Fade from black, perhaps, okay? I got at least one left, right? Black was very formalistic. Categories. Article 1, Article 2, Article 3. If it's not in the Constitution, it doesn't exist. Jackson said, listen, right? Things aren't so clear, right? Things are flexible. We have to have a flexible Constitution because we can't resolve things by such rigid categories. And his opinion opens up in what I think is remarkable candor, remarkable honesty, where he says, you know what, my experience in the president's administration is a, quote, realistic influence of my views. He's honest. He's like, listen, I've been there, right? I've been in that office where the president says, can I do this? I know what that question means. And he says, there's really a poverty of useful authority to decide this, right? There's no clear answer. This is not like a restatement of contracts or a restatement of torts where it tells you the elements of negligence. No, no, no. These are really deep questions, and there's not a right answer. There's not. So Marshall, I'm sorry, no, they're in my mind on the same parallel. Jackson says that presidential powers are not fixed. They fluctuate with Congress, right? Is that Andrew? Andrew, what does that mean? That the president's powers fluctuate with Congress?
It means that it talks about the expressed.
Don't get to the zones yet. We'll get there in a minute. But what does that mean, just generally speaking, that the president's powers fluctuate with Congress?
Well, depending on what Congress is doing, may give him more authority or less.
Exactly. We shouldn't be so formalistic like Black to say, is in the Constitution? Nope, done. We should look at what's actually going on. Does Congress agree with the president? Is Congress giving that sort of power, right? And Jackson builds on this to develop a framework, one of the few we have in ConLaw, that analyzes how close the president is to Congress. The closer the president is to Congress, the stronger are his powers. The further the president is from Congress, the weaker are his powers. And not just that his powers are weaker, but that the courts will more closely scrutinize those actions. Because if the president and Congress agree, who are the courts to step in and second guess? But if the president and Congress are at odds, that is the perfect opportunity for the courts to intervene. Everyone see that? So he identifies these three tiers, and law students love writing down, okay, this is a tier 1 case, this is a tier 2 case. No. They're not fixed lines between 1 and 2. This is what we call a gradient, or a spectrum, if you will, where we try to sincerely look at how close are the president and Congress. Okay, so let's write them out. That's Michelle, right?
Yes.
Michelle, walk me through. Okay, let me start typing here. Walk me through what's the point where the president is at his strongest authority? How do we know the president's acting at his apogee, his pinnacle, the crescent? How do we know that? What has to happen?
Would that be where a president has asked for the authority from the Congress
And what they do?
and they vote on that?
And did they give him what he wanted?
Yes.
Yes, okay. The president's authority is at its maximum, right? When he's acting to an express or implied grant of power. In other words, let me make this point very clear. When Congress says, Mr. President, you can take the steel mills, and it's very clear, there's no question that he can do so constitutionally, right? Remember we said a few minutes ago that it wasn't clear that the executive branch could take property? Well, if Congress gave him that explicit authority, the courts will not second guess. We say in this case that judicial scrutiny is minimal. In other words, courts are not going to second guess when there's an express or implied grant of power from Congress. In other words, the judicial scrutiny is minimal when Congress and the president agree. Where they're on the same page, right? They agree. Courts are not going to second guess them and get in the way. Jackson writes, and I'll copy this phrase, which I like, there is the strongest presumption of constitutionality. What's Tam? What's the presumption of constitutionality? What does that mean? No, I said Tam down here.
I said Tim, I'm sorry.
Oh, close. Yeah. Tam, right here. What does this phrase "presumption of constitutionality" mean?
The action that the president.
What's a presumption?
Assumption.
Good. So, imagine you have a scale of justice, right? And on one side you have, the president wins, and the other side you have that the steel mill owners win, right? If you're Lady Justice, right, and you're applying presumption of constitutionality, is it an even scale? What do you do? Imagine Lady Justice sticking her thumb on the scale and saying, you know what? You have the president, you have the steel owners, I'm going to put my thumb on the president's scale. I'm going to presume that the president wins. You can rebut it, right? I mean, maybe you have a lot of evidence on the other side, but the president's going to win on this presumption of constitutionality. Okay? Let's skip the second one for a minute. Let's go to the third. Promise I'll come back to it. Is that Daryl?
Yes.
Daryl, when is the president acting at his lowest ebb?
When he's going against, when what he says is incompatible, when it's Congress hasn't spoken on, or they said no, or he's kind of
Exactly.
not even consulting, but doing it and saying, sue me later if he wants to.
Yeah, basically when the president takes actions that are incompatible with the express or implied will, the president at his lowest ebb. Okay? When the president basically does something that Congress said no to. In other words, the president asked Congress, can I seize the mills? Congress said, no, we won't give you that statute. The president does it anyway. It's at the lowest ebb. And how does judicial scrutiny work here, Terrell?
Then they're going to get involved. They're going to step in and kind of look at it.
Yes. We quote, scrutinize with caution. What does it mean, scrutinize with caution, Daryl?
They want to be very careful they don't step all over the Constitution. They don't want to get that.
Good.
whacked or anything.
So if in stage number one you put the thumb on the scale of constitutionality, where does the thumb go on this side?
In this case, on the steel mills a little bit.
Yeah. So this might be called a presumption of liberty. And this is a phrase popularized by a mentor of mine, Randy Barnett at Georgetown, right? If we're not applying a presumption of constitutionality, where they put the thumb down in the government scale, you put the thumb down on the side of liberty, the idea that the steel owners have a right to their mills, and if the Constitution says the president can't do it, then he can't do it. By the way, is that Nina? Oh, Nina. Which zone does Jackson think that we're in this case? Why are we in zone 3 in this case? Exactly. Jackson, we're in zone 3 in this case, right? Because Congress specifically withheld the authority that he needed. And because we're in zone 3, we scrutinize with caution. And even though the president is in a time of war, in the middle of the crisis, and all this other stuff, we can still rule against the president. In other words, from Jackson, if this was a close call, I think the president would have probably won. So Nina, sorry. What do we call the middle region? How do we define this area between 1 and 2?
It's where the president acts in absence of the congressional grant.
You're on the right track.
Or denial of authority.
What's the beautiful phrase he used to describe this zone, this middle tier? It's a beautiful image. I mean, Jackson had such a way with words. No, it's very pretty. It was a TV show named after it.
Okay. He can only rely upon his own
No.
powers, but there's a zone of twilight.
Yes. The zone of twilight, or the twilight zone for your Rod Serling fans, right? The zone of twilight. Marcelo, what's the zone of twilight? What does this mean? What's twilight, by the way? The word people use to think about. What does twilight mean? Right here, twilight. It's on your book. What does twilight mean?
I don't really know.
I've never seen those movies, or those books either. What is it? Tina?
Soft loading, appear to state of obscurity, ambiguity, gradual decline.
Good. Okay, I'll come back to it in a second, right? Twilight, right? So you know when the sun is setting, right? It's not quite day. It's not quite night. There's some light, there's some darkness. You can't really tell what it is. That's twilight, right? You don't know exactly what's going on. The zone of twilight, like she said a second ago, refers to like uncertainty, right? You don't exactly know whether President or Congress agreed, right? There's an absence of congressional authority. In other words, Congress didn't say yes or no. Congress did not say yes or no. We don't know what Congress thinks, right? Since we don't know what Congress thinks, we can't say whether he's acting at his maximum or his minimum. We just don't know. So Maricela, in this middle region, right, where we don't know what Congress thinks, how do we understand whether the president's acting lawfully? What does Jackson say?
You might sometimes, at least as a practice matter, enable, if not invite measures of independence.
Don't read. Tell me what's Jackson saying? Look up. Good. One of the things I try to get is eye contact. Eye contact's always good. So if you're from court, whatever. Yeah. So explain to me in your own words. What's Jackson saying about how do we know if we're in the second tier if the president's acting lawfully?
Will they measure? I guess they measure it by his responsibility. Well, they look at what his responsibilities are.
Okay.
And they measure based on his acts of whether.
You're on the right track. Nuri, you want to take a stab at it?
They look at circumstances and
Good.
see the impact of his decision, how and the necessity of it.
So which justice does this most resemble, looking to like practice and history? What's his name?
One
Hot dogs.
Frankfurt.
Yeah. This is very much like Frankfurter, right? What's Jackson saying? We don't know whether, Congress agrees or not. We look to practice. We look to what's called acquiescence. We said before, right? Has Congress basically ratified it? Has Congress objected to it, right? We're judges. We don't know for sure. How can we look to the practice and events and what's actually going on? But in any event, Nuri, how do you think Zone 2 shakes out? Does the president win, or does the Liberty Cause win? How do you think this one will usually shake out?
Liberty Cause?
No. Interesting.
I personally think that the president should win.
If it's unclear.
Yes.
Why do you think that?
Especially in a case such as this, where you're in the middle of war, whether the Congress is stated or not, and that there's a possibility that if the military stop, that it may affect the soldiers that you sent out. You have a responsibility as the chief to make sure that you don't put them in harm's way, especially if in case of something.
Even if it's not clear the statutory authority one way or the other.
I also do think that it should be compensated, going back to.
Whoa, but who can compensate? Could the president even compensate by himself? Why can't the president compensate himself? Power of the purse, which is a reason probably why the president can't do this also. So what do you think? Is that Kevin? Kevin, let's say we're in the zone of twilight, right? Let's pretend the facts were different and Congress was silent. They didn't say yes, they didn't say no. How would you resolve this if you were a judge in the zone of twilight? What would you do?
He doesn't have the money to back him or to compensate him. So I would say that he can't just take people's essentially lives.
So you're looking to actually the text of the Constitution, right? Saying, well, because Congress is the power of the purse, the president can't do it. Is that what your argument is? Okay, all right, Tim, you jumped the gun before. You're up now. What do you think?
I like the previous answers, but
Yeah, try something different.
I
I keep going back to the history. I mean, I think if you look at the president and look at what's happened before, I just think that you would have to scrutinize his actions based on what's happened before.
What do you think Jackson's afraid of in light of his work experience? What do you think was a very important experience in his life that maybe makes him vote, in this case, what he does?
Being the overseeing the Nuremberg trials.
Yeah. How do you think he realized, or how do you think he viewed executives claiming emergency powers? What do you think that made him think of?
Well, I know he referenced the Weimar Republic. Their Congress basically, I think the Bund, I can't remember what their Congress body is, but they basically, Reichstag, yeah. They actually gave the executive, I think it was Hindenburg, more and more power, and then once he died, Hitler became basically chancellor and was able just to seize power, whatever he wanted.
The Nazis were born through emergency powers. The Weimar Republic, which I hope you've studied at some point in your schooling, basically gave the chance all these emergency powers, saying, "Oh, we only need this for this crisis. We need this for this crisis." And by the way, after all these emergency powers built up, and you couldn't stop it. And Jackson's opinion, and I want you to take a look at the very end of it. I don't know the page number, but the very last page. And I want to just call it the page number? 185. Thank you. I'll try and bring up here. What he says, I think, is extremely specific. So I just want to read it. 185. So let's scroll. He's speaking from history, right? He's speaking as someone who understood what happened in these sorts of emergencies, right? So he says here, start up here. I have no illusion that anything the court does here can check the hands of the government, right? He's just a judge. You can imagine a different circumstance where a judge says, you can't seize the steel mills. And a chancellor, say, call him Adolf, says, I'm going to do it anyway, right? There's no requirement that Truman listened to him. Imagine if after the Supreme Court said, let the steel mill go, and Truman said no. This is when stuff gets real in the Constitution, right? We didn't have that, thankfully. But Jackson's under no illusions, right? And he says, the tools, right? Only Congress can prevent its powers from slipping through its fingers. So what's he saying there? Hey, Congress, get off your butts and defend your prerogative, right? The president just did this, and you guys are sitting there being quiet. How can you guys be so stupid to let an executive run over you like this? Because when the executive runs over you and you do nothing to stop it, that builds practice. That builds history. And future presidents can cite it to do more worse stuff. This will be a big lesson today. When Congress lets the executive do stuff and doesn't stop them, that's just a dangerous precedent going forward. Okay? He says here, we don't have an efficient government. You know what? Parliamentary governments. Are you from Denmark, sir?
Yes.
You have a parliamentary system there, right?
Yeah.
And basically, if the prime minister loses his authority, you just have a new election and you throw them all out, right?
Yeah.
We don't have that here, right? We don't have a parliamentary system where whenever the government's doing something people don't like, you throw them out. They serve their terms out regardless. We don't have a very efficient government either. In fact, all the different checks and balances are designed to be inefficient, right? We'll discuss a case called Noel Canning in a couple weeks, but there's a great line about gridlock. People often see gridlock as a bad thing. I don't. Gridlock is a sign that the process is working. When things are grinding to a halt, that means people don't agree on stuff, and you shouldn't be making laws. And Jackson writes, with all its defects, delays, and inconveniences, men have discovered no technique for long preserving free government, except that the executive be under the law, and the law be made by parliamentary deliberations. In other words, ambition must counteract ambition. The only way men have discovered to control government is for government to be under law. And then this last sentence gives me chills every time I read it. I'll read it again. Jackson says, Such institutions may be destined to pass away. In other words, there's no guarantee we have a rule of law. We can have a Chancellor Hitler come over tomorrow in this country and nothing can stop it, right? Parchment barriers, paper. But it is the duty of this court to be the last, not the first, to give them up. In other words, Congress, maybe you're willing to roll over and let the president run over you, but not us, not the judges of this court. This job fell to us, and damn it, we're going to do it. If you're going to ignore us, go ahead and ignore us. But we will not cede. We will be the last ones, not the first ones to give it up. Gives me chills every time I read it. And this, again, was a man who had spent years of his life prosecuting Nazis, who came of power when the great nations of the world, Germany, one of those advanced technical nations in the world, and the atrocities that came there from people that were so cultured. So, this opinion, you know why this is the opinion people talk about. No one talks about Justice Black with respect to Justice Black. Jackson's where it's at. And in fact, in subsequent decisions, the court has basically said that Jackson's was the main opinion. That's whoever it's cited. Justice Kagan, Justice Sotomayor, Roberts, and Alito all cited this during those confirmation hearings as the definitive framework. All right, any questions on Jackson?
I have one quick question. How does this latter part of his opinion mesh with his first example of where Congress and the president interact, or he has the most power? If Congress has a supermajority with the same, when he's within the same political party as the president, and they pass laws that are
Violate the
basically against
Constitution.
the will of the people, yeah.
Okay, well, that's a good question, right? What happens if you have a supermajority and you have a president, let's call him Franklin Roosevelt, who passes laws that are clearly unconstitutional? What does the court do? We'll talk about this in a couple weeks, right? So, no surprise, our Constitution has a Commerce Clause, which we'll study. And originally, it was actually quite narrow. It only affected the regulation of commerce between the states. Franklin Roosevelt said, no, that's not good enough. I need a federal power over stuff going on outside one state. And in a series of decisions, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. You can't do that. Until at one point, Franklin Roosevelt threatened to pack the courts and add new justices who would vote his way. Hugo Black was one of them, right, that he would consider adding. The justices changed their minds. The 5-4 decisions one way started going the other way, and the court acquiesced. So, you know, this is not quite doomsday, but the court gave up in the New Deal. And it's poetic because Jackson was a New Deal justice that came of power because the court gave up, saying we will no longer enforce limited powers of the federal Constitution. Yes. Yes.
How's the Supreme Court pick which justice delivers the opinion of the court?
Oh, beautiful. Thank you so much for that question. So usually what happens is after the case is argued, there's something called a conference, okay? And at the conference, the justices vote. And the most senior justice in the majority gets to assign the opinion, right? So if there are 5 justices in the majority and the chief justice in the majority, he assigns who gets to write it. If the chief justice is not in the majority, the most senior associate justice gets a vote, and on the way down, right? So now, for example, if Chief Justice Roberts is in the majority, he gets to assign the opinion, right? If, you know, Justice Ginsburg is most senior justice in the majority, she gets to assign it. But that probably doesn't happen very often. It's a very important job of the chief to assign opinions who gets to write. So here, had the Chief Justice vote.
You asking me?
Yeah, I'm asking you. You asked the question. Had the Chief Justice vote?
He concurred.
He did not concur.
Chief Justice?
Vincent.
Oh, because, okay, correct.
So Chief Justice Vinson dissented. Why do you think Black wrote the majority opinion? I have to check that. Actually, I'm pretty sure no one's ever asked him. I'm pretty sure he was most senior in the majority. I'm like 90% sure I'm right, but I'm going to check that later. But yeah, he gave it to himself.
I was actually going to touch on the fact that he worked for Roosevelt.
Who worked for Roosevelt? Jackson?
Jackson.
Yeah.
So you're alluding to in Nuremberg that, like you said, Roosevelt really shoved a lot of stuff through. And do you think maybe it was, as time had passed since Roosevelt had passed,
maybe he was rethinking about some of the things that he was helping massage through.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. I don't have nearly enough time to do justice to your question, unfortunately. But Justice Jackson is one of the few justices who became more conservative with time. He was appointed as a New Dealer, and he actually became a somewhat conservative judge, which is rare because usually judges go to the left. He's one of the exceptions. But there's a lot to be said about Justice Jackson. I can talk later about it. I really can't go much more than that here. Yeah.
On the Jackson three-part test, more or less, this is a test for how the judicial should weigh the exercise of the executive power.
Yes, sir.
Right? And they talk about implied a lot.
Oh, yeah. What Jackson doesn't like implied powers. Why does he not like implied powers?
They say it's like the implied will of Congress, and implied consent of Congress, and implied authority of Congress. But then we only talk about express examples without really.
Well, there can be implied, right? So let me give you an example, right? Let's say Congress didn't pass a statute that says the president can seize a steel mill. Well, let's say they passed a statute saying, in times of emergency, the president has authority over labor strikes. Okay, so it's not expressed, but maybe it's an implied that he could do this. Understood? Michelle?
Okay, so since the Congress had 4 to 5 years before Truman had done this, it made it clear that
No. Yeah, you can't do it.
you can't do it. So my question is that why wasn't that considered a precedence in that the Congress had already said no?
Well, that's why we're in zone 3, right?
Right.
We're in zone 3 because
They were.
Congress said no.
I realize that. But my point is they kept pointing to this, well, there was no declaration of war. He never went to Congress to begin with.
That was a little bit of a rant, what we call a dicta, right? He was making a point saying we can't have these undeclared wars justifying emergencies because it's not even a real war, right? Even if there was a commander-in-chief issue, because it's not a real war, his powers haven't been activated yet. Understand? Until there's an actual declaration of war, the commander-in-chief powers aren't turned on.
Okay, so I mean, was this a grab for power here? Meaning, was the court looking?
Do you think
at this-
Truman was trying to grab power here? Honestly, do you think Truman was trying to grab power here? What do you think Truman was trying to do?
Well, obviously he, thumbs and nose at the Congress. He does this.
I think he's thumb his nose at the Congress. He said, Congress, if you guys want to stop me, do something about it. But until then, I'm going to keep acting.
The Congress had already made it clear 4 to 5 years earlier. We're not going to let presidents.
Well,
do
that was a
this.
different Congress, so that wasn't there during the time of crisis. I mean, look,
I'm just saying.
Truman didn't actually thumb his nose at Congress, right? He didn't. And let's give him credit where it's due. He said, if you guys want to stop me, go ahead, but until you don't, we keep doing it. Let me give you a contemporary example. So we're at war now, which you may or may not know, against ISIS, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, or whatever you want to call them, okay? We've never had a declaration of war against ISIS. We're actually fighting them based on a 2001 authorization against Al-Qaeda and a 2002 authorization against Iraq. So there's a problem with the first one, right? What's the problem with the first one? ISIS and Al-Qaeda are not the same thing. In fact, ISIS and Al-Qaeda are at war. They hate each other. They can't stand each other. What about the Iraq resolution? Well, they're not just in Iraq. They're also in Syria, okay? So how are we attacking ISIS without a declaration? Well, President Obama, about a year ago to this date, sent an authorization letter to Congress saying, I already have the authority to do this. If you want to stop me, go ahead, but I'm going to keep doing it anyway. In other words, I already have all the authority I need. Try and stop me. That's thumbing noses, right? The executive says, I have all the authority I need. Try and stop me, right? Impeach me. Throw me out. Defund my war. Go ahead. I dare you. I double dog dare you, right?
Yeah, that was my question. Why would you send me?
Ah, what a beautiful question. Thank you so much. Why does Congress keep funding something that is very likely illegal? Why do you think? Yeah.
Because from a political standpoint, they don't want to be, they're voted in, so they don't want to see that they're putting the country at some sort of.
Yeah, right. Yeah, want to add anything?
Well, I was in the National Guard when they decided to almost defund. We were told not to send drills that month because they were unsure if they were going to have funding. Talk about the demoralizing effect on troops.
So here's the thing, right? politically, it's easy to be lazy, right? Don't take the vote, just do nothing. We'll discuss a lot in this class the idea that Congress gives up their role. And go back to what Jackson wrote, if I may, for a second, right? Jackson wrote, only Congress itself can prevent power from slipping through its fingers, right? What happens when Congress gives up its power of the purse and Congress continues to fund stuff that's illegal? Courts aren't going to stop it. If Congress can't even take the stand against illegal action, what the heck are the courts going to do? This is why Jackson said, if Congress and the courts are in agreement, who am I to stop them, right? If the president's engaged in a legal war and Congress keeps funding it, even if they don't vote on the authority for it, the fact that they keep funding it means they're accepting it. So I'll give you another example. We'll talk a lot in this question about the president's action on immigration, right? Congress considered defunding the executive action immigration. They couldn't because it's actually funded by user fees. So they considered shutting down DHS for the president to stop it. Eventually they said, no, we can't do that. It's too politically costly, right? We'll let this ongoing thing happen, and that means we basically acquiesce. Sir?
So by not defunding in a legal war, would that be expressed?
Maybe implied, right? By continuing to fund it, it's implied saying, okay, whatever. Yes, ma'am. I love your questions. Yes, they do, right? They take an oath to the Constitution. But they don't all keep that oath. So the dissent, right? The dissent basically says, listen, we're in a time of war here, right? Let's not be stupid judges. We have to recognize that people can die because of this, right? If it's not entirely clear the president lacks the authority, we should defer. So what happened afterwards? Within minutes of the court's rulings, the steelworkers went on strike. Minutes later, they all went on strike, right? And the strike lasted almost 2 months. Obviously, the gloom and doom predictions were not correct. They often are not in these separation of powers cases. And there's a great story. I don't know if it's true or not, but I'll tell it anyway. Where apparently Justice Black was invited to the White House. And President Truman said, Hugo, I don't much care for your law, but by golly, this bourbon's good. It's probably not true. It's one of those great stories that probably never happened. But it shows, for better or worse, that we get along and the republic continues, right? This was one of those cases where our republic could have ground to a halt had the court said no and the president said too bad. Like, done. I mean, what the heck happens then when you have the president ignores the Supreme Court? This is one of those, like, oh crap moments, if I may, with the virgin ears in this room, right? Where things could have gone really awry and they did not. I could spend an entire class on this, an entire semester on this case, but unfortunately I get 90 minutes. Yeah.
One more quick thing on the dissent side.
Yeah.
Because I'm still waiting on my Amazon to deliver my book and go outside.
Oh, sure. Yep.
One of the interesting arguments I saw, it's not a very convincing argument, but it talked about the argument that Truman was engaged in a
Uh-huh.
on an overseas action, and that could have given him a justification for seizing the steel and trying to uphold the treaty.
Well, yeah. I mean, so look, the president gets authority from statutes of the Constitution, right? And under our Constitution, treaties are considered law. So could the president get authority under the treaty to seize the steel mills? This is a very difficult question, which we'll study later in the semester, right? Does a treaty give the president more powers to violate constitutional rights? Right? Can the president, there's a case involving Texas, Medellin versus Texas. So back when Governor Bush was in office, there was a Mexican national named Medellin who was about to be executed in Texas for murder and rape and very, very gruesome crimes. Medellin wasn't given access to a consular official. In other words, he didn't get to talk to a Mexican consular official while he was on trial. Okay, the United States signed a treaty saying you were required to let any foreign national speak to a consular agent before they're convicted of a crime. Never happened. Okay, Texas said, forget it, we don't care. while George Bush was president, he claimed that as president, he could tell Texas not to execute this individual. Texas said, screw you. And actually, that case was argued by none other than Ted Cruz, who was our Solicitor General at the time. And the Supreme Court said, yes, the treaty does not give the president the power to violate the separation of powers. The president cannot tell a state to execute or not execute someone. But there are cases saying, in other situations, treaties give the president and Congress more power. Okay, any questions on Youngstown? Yes, sir.
Well, it's kind of sort of about Youngstown, but how different is this case from the air traffic controllers strike? I think that was in the 80s.
PATCO, yeah. Well, what about it?
So, I mean, it sounds like, to me at least right now, this is a little similar in the fact that I think it was Reagan that decided to.
He fired them. Well, he didn't take over, he fired them. I mean, basically what happened was it was an air traffic control strike, he just fired all of them. He said, okay, we'll start over. Yeah. So, yeah, so, no, I mean, he didn't, but that would not, yeah, okay. Any other question in Youngstown? Seriously, I could do an entire semester on this case if we get 90 minutes. Yes, Mildred.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question. How is it different from the
Because he didn't seize anyone, he just fired people.
They're federal employees also.
You can just fire them, yeah, I mean. Anything else? Okay, so the second case we'll talk about today is McCulloch v. Maryland. And this case always gives people trouble, not the least of which because it's so difficult to read. This is a tough case to read, right? It just slogs on and on with the sovereignty and this and that. Marshall has some good opinions. This is not one of the better written ones. I don't know why, but it drives people nuts. But necessary and proper often gives students difficulties, and I'll try to explain this as clearly as I can to obviate those problems, right? So we start off with Article 1, Section 8. If you turn to your pocket constitutions, please. Page, starting on page 7. Okay. Article 1, Section 8 lists all of the powers that Congress has. Congress can only do what's listed in Article 1, Section 8. Right? There are about 18 things. Things like, taxes, regulating commerce, coining money, punishing counterfeits, establish post offices, things like this, right? There's a fairly limited number of things that Congress can do. But then we get to the very last one. And it says, Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying to execution the foregoing powers. What does this mean? And I'll give you a very easy example. So, Michael? Yep. So the Constitution gives Congress the power to create postal roads, right? And post offices, right? Is there anything in the Constitution saying that Congress can buy mail trucks?
No.
Is there anything in the Constitution saying that Congress can hire postal workers? Is there anything in the Constitution saying that Congress can build a post office?
Probably not that specific.
No. So use a good word, specific, right? How does the Constitution decide things? On specifics or generalities?
Broad set of specifics, but in order to carry them out, the necessary and proper.
Good, very good.
is what they use to execute.
Good. So when you see necessary and proper, right? Don't focus on necessary and proper. Focusing on this phrase, carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Just underline that in your little constitutions, right? Carrying into execution the foregoing powers. And Michael, you said it a minute ago. What does that mean to carry into execution? What does that mean?
You need to actually implement whatever.
Implement. I like that word. Implement. I like implement, right? So in order to have a power to have a postal system, you need to hire mail trucks, right? You need to buy horses. You need to hire mailmen, right? You need to build a post office, right? You need to do a lot of stuff to execute that power. What necessary and proper lets you do is stuff not written in the Constitution, but necessary to execute those powers. Everyone understand that? This topic always throws students off. The necessary and proper clause grants additional powers to do this or do that which is necessary to carry into execution the foregoing powers. Yes, sir.
Call that the elastic clause with every.
Yeah, people call it the elastic clause. I don't really like that because that means you're actually stretching the Constitution, which is not accurate. You're actually augmenting it, actually stretching it. But the high school teachers love calling it that, whatever. Okay. So let's look again at Article 1, Section 8. And let's look at what's included, right? So it says Congress can borrow money, right? Congress can regulate commerce. Congress can coin money. Okay? So there are lots of things that Congress can do that affect money. Is that Pamela? Pamela, what about the creation of a bank? Is there anything in the Constitution that says Congress can charter or create a bank? Why not? Why is there nothing in the Constitution saying Congress create a bank? Is that something that they should have added? Ooh, good. How do we imply a power to make a bank? You said probably need. Is it necessary? Ah, I'm going to repeat what Pamela just said. What she said was exactly right. She said, in order to regulate commerce and coin money and do these things, it's probably useful to have a bank, right? Useful, right? It will be easier. Could Pamela, could Congress do all these things without a bank? Yeah. Congress could definitely coin money and regulate commerce without a bank. They don't need that. Would it be easier with a bank? Okay. And this is the inquiry of what necessary and proper means, right? It would be impossible to have a postal system without, horses and carriages and trucks, right? You can't deliver mail to an entire country on foot, right? You absolutely positively need a mail route with trucks and horses to, deliver mail. But, to Pamela's question, do you need a bank to regulate money? Pamela? No. Would it be convenient? So here's the question, right? What does necessary and proper mean? Does necessary and proper mean convenient? Or does necessary and proper mean absolutely necessary? Okay? So, Joseph, what does the court hold? What does John Marshall hold in McCulloch? How do we understand necessary and proper? I know they could incorporate the bank, right? But how does he understand the phrase necessary and proper? How does he define it?
You said not to look at it too narrowly.
Good. Convenient, exactly. That's the word Marshall uses, right? Marshall says necessary and proper doesn't mean absolutely necessary. It means convenient. In other words, would it be convenient, Joseph, for the United States to have a bank to regulate money and to coin money and all this stuff? Would it be convenient? Okay. And if it's convenient, can they do it? Yes. Marshall says that this clause is not a limitation of powers. In other words, this doesn't limit what Congress can do. It's an addition of powers that necessary and proper adds or supplements that which Congress could otherwise do. In other words, you list all the things in Article 1, Section 8, and then you add this one at the end to supplement and say they can also do things which are convenient, right? Is that in the back? That's Lee? Yes. Lee, does it make sense to force Congress to only use those means which are only necessary, which are absolutely necessary. Does that make much sense? Yeah. What's the key? How would you describe our government from Marshall's perspective? What word would you use?
Well, as was previously stated, convenience.
Yeah. Oh, now you're speaking my language, right? What did Hamilton say, right?
He said, his argument between Madison.
Oh, perfect.
He argued that necessary means convenience.
Oh, beautiful. All right, so let's talk about this debate, okay? So we discussed this a few minutes ago, but this was not the first time we had a debate over a bank in the United States, right? Remarkably, the very first Congress in 1789, right? James Madison sitting in the House, right? They debated they debated whether they could create a bank. And this bill was debated and debated and debated. And it went to President Washington. So imagine this, right? You're George Washington, President of the United States, and who's in your cabinet? Well, you have James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton, right? You have these three guys sitting and say, all right, guys, what do you think? Right? What do you think? So Washington asks Madison. And Madison tells him, you can't do this, right? Congress can only do that which is absolutely necessary. And you don't need a bank to regulate commerce. We don't want Congress making all these banks because it'll intrude on state sovereignty, right? Okay, so then Washington says, fine. He asked Jefferson, right? Jefferson, what do you think, Tom, right? And Jefferson says, by the way, he was a farmer. He was an agrarian. He did not trust banks at all. So he was very skeptical in general. So he asked Jefferson and says, wait a minute, right? This banks will oppress the states. We can't give Congress this power. This is like when mom says no and dad says no, you ask grandpa, right? So George Washington goes to a guy named Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was the Secretary of the Treasury and was a fiscal genius. I mean, the last time the United States had a zero deficit was when he was in charge. Alexander Hamilton got our deficit down to zero. Never happen again. And Hamilton basically says, well, wait a minute, right? We need a bank to regulate commerce, right? This is not something that's so strict. It's whatever is convenient for Congress. Why do we want to handcuff Congress? Why do we want to make their job difficult, right? This is a constitution that will endure for ages. Let Congress choose whatever means are convenient to them. If they want to make a bank, let them make a bank. If they want to do this, let them do that. We need our government to work. We should not be so formalistic. So the same exact debates between Black and Jackson, that whether we're formalistic to the Constitution, existed in 1791, right? All the way to the beginning of our republic. How close we stick to the text of the Constitution. And so, Lee, how did Marshall say? Did he agree with Hamilton or did he agree with Madison? Very good. Yeah. Yeah, Hamilton was a very smart guy. He actually went to Columbia, was then called King's College, was a very smart guy. I mean, his history, he grew up as a bastard orphan in the Caribbean, and he rose through the ranks to be General Washington's lieutenant. It's a remarkable story. Rod Chernow wrote a great book on Hamilton. I commend it to you. Okay, so Hamilton won. So in the debate between Madison and Hamilton, Hamilton won out this debate. Okay, so that's the first part of Marbury. That's the first part of McCulloch v. Maryland, right? Could Congress charter the Bank of the United States? Was that within the necessary and proper authority? John Marshall said yes, because it would be convenient to charter a bank to regulate commerce and coin money, do these things. Congress can do it. We need a government to endure for the ages, Marshall wrote, right? We need to have flexibility. Let's not put handcuffs on Congress. Let's have them the various tools at their disposal to most effectively manage government. Yes, sir.
Didn't he also say, or wasn't it also an argument that basically the means will justify the end?
Ooh, good. What do you mean?
Because he says in the holding, if the end be legitimate and within the scope of the Constitution.
Good. What page is that on? I want to pull that one up.
My highlights.
I don't have it.
I typed it into my notes.
202? Yeah, I mean, what you just said, I was going to call on you next, actually perfect. It's basically the holding of the case in a sentence. 202. There we go, right? Here we go. All right, everyone see this. This is basically This is like the black letter holding of McCulloch. And Marshall writes, let the end be legitimate. Let it be within the scope of the Constitution. And all means which are appropriate, which are plainly adapted to that end, which are not prohibited, but consist with the letter and spirit of the Constitution, are constitutional, right? What does that mean, Ansel? How do you interpret that statement?
Means justify the end. If the argument is that purpose necessary and proper, whatever it was. So is, whatever it is necessary and proper, and if so, then whatever means.
So is there anything illegitimate about establishing a bank?
Nothing illegitimate about it, no.
So if the means the bank is legitimate, can you do it?
If the bank is legitimate, you can establish a bank.
Okay. So basically what Marshall's saying here is so long as what you're doing, right, so long as establishing the bank itself is legitimate,
Right.
it's within the Constitution. That's what I have.
Well, legitimate means proper, but you still go back to the necessary. If they wanted.
Perfect. Stop right there. Stop right there. You said proper. All we're talking about here is necessary. What does proper mean?
Well, I thought what we were just discussing was proper.
Exactly. How do we know if the creation of a bank is proper or not?
If it's within the boundaries of what they can do.
What does that mean? Government. What are those boundaries, Angela?
The boundaries are whatever those. In other words, if coining money and if it's not prohibited, it's constitutional.
So let me ask you another question, right? Let me ask you another question. Give you a preview of Obamacare. We'll come back to this, right? The Affordable Care Act, among its many vices, requires people to purchase health insurance. The government argued that in order to have a healthcare system, we need people to buy into the system to keep costs low. In other words, it will be convenient for us. It will be convenient for everyone to have health insurance. If you don't, you pay a penalty. But was it proper? In other words, could Congress go in and require people to buy health insurance? And I'll give you a preview. The answer is no. The Supreme Court held that this was a, quote, great substantive and independent power. In other words, unlike the creation of a bank, which was proper, requiring people to buy insurance was frankly unprecedented and a great substantive and independent power that cannot be justified. So really, NFIB v. Sebelius, the Obamacare case, recognized that our limits on propriety, on proper. Okay, but here, creation of a bank, no big deal has been done before. Making people buy health insurance, that was novel and could not.
I think where I was getting at with that is when you get to convenient and necessary, weren't our forefathers smart enough to say convenient or necessary and proper? So by establishing that bank, didn't they in essence kind of open up the precedent to allow something like Obamacare by bringing in the word, confusing the terms necessary and convenient?
Well, the word convenience is not in the Constitution, is it?
Correct.
By the way, again, John Marshall isn't necessarily right. In fact, there's a legitimate discussion that actually Madison was correct and Hamilton was wrong, and that Congress could not charter the bank, right? Just because Marshall said it doesn't mean he was right. Law students hate when I say that, but they're not always correct because they wrote the opinion.
So I take it Madison would not have been for Obamacare.
Talk to me after class about that one. So the second part of the opinion, which I'll spend much less time on, actually involves the sexy facts of the case. So what happened here? The United States government opened up a bank in Maryland. A Maryland tax collector went to the bank and fined McCulloch, who worked for the bank, saying, hey, wait a minute, you guys didn't pay a Maryland, it required a stamp, right? A Maryland stamp, right? Said, you didn't buy this, I'm gonna fine you. Okay, so, okay, all the way around, back up top, Ariel. Could the state of Maryland fine or tax the federal bank official? Why not? This was the second part of the holding. Hope everyone got through to the end. I know it's a long case, but it's an important one. This is probably the more important cases we have. You have it? Ariel? Lindsay, you want to take it? We're running a little bit short on time. I don't know the page. Why can Maryland not tax a federal bank, Lindsay? No. What does that mean? What was there any federal law saying that the states can't tax the federal government? Then what conflict is there? That's okay.
Well, because taxing to destroy the bank.
What does that mean, the power to tax and the power to destroy? We've all heard this. What does that mean?
Well, if they were to tax a certain amount of money, they would be able to function after a while, so it would destroy the bank.
Good. So, Sandra, let me ask you this question, right? If the local, Houston City Council raises taxes, what's the remedy against that? And people don't like it. What can the people of Houston do? Oh no, short of that. What else can they do if the local city council raises, say, property tax and people don't like it? Oh, happened in November. Vote the bums out, right? God bless democracy. If they raise our tax, we vote the bums out. Screw the children, right? We don't care. In our system of government, right? If the government does something we don't like, we can throw the bums out. But let me ask this question too. Is that Maria? Maria, what happens if Maryland starts taxing the federal government? How does that work? Is that who votes for whom?
Yeah, it's so clear that the government of the union have no security.
Exactly right. If our local government raises their taxes and does something that's unjust, we can throw the bums out. But what's the cost for Maryland to tax the federal government? None. The people of Maryland are not going to be affected at all. Who pays the bill? All 13 states, right? Marshall basically says if you allow one state to tax the federal branch, the cost gets spread throughout and there's no political accountability. So there's no way of stopping this. So it's not that the federal law trumps the state law, right? It's that to have a federal institution, which Congress can create, the states cannot destroy it.
So is this just determined in practice and application?
I'm sorry?
They just determine this in the application of the facts that are going on now? Or is this interpretation of the Constitution?
You tell me.
No, it's a question.
No. There's a question too. You tell me.
Well, I mean, I would assume from the judicial standpoint, looking at both of them in tandem, and then trying.
Where does it say in the Constitution, Lindsay, right? Where does it say in the Constitution that the power to tax is the power to destroy, and states can't tax federal government because it will destroy their entity? Does it say that anywhere in the Constitution?
No, it doesn't say that, but the ramifications of that undercut the benefit of what the Constitution was trying to provide.
Which is what?
Governmental structure, for the betterment of society. So that
What were the failings of the Articles of Confederation, right? What were the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation that John Marshall is intimately familiar with? Anyone else? Let's see, who's next on our list? Is that Adriana? What were the failings of the Articles of Confederation that may have pushed John Marshall to vote the way he did? Anyone else? We're a little short on time. Yeah, Neri?
With central federal government.
Why? What was the problem with the weak central federal government?
At that time, the people that were afraid that it would turn into the same thing with the king, and they were running into the same issue, so it gave more power to the states. And there was
But what was the problem with the weak central government?
no stable currency.
Yeah. Oh, good. Yeah.
Well, they didn't have power to lay taxes on anybody, so they depended on the states for their own survival at their, at their behest.
Good.
The issue with the Articles of Confederation, they couldn't get money from the state to fund the war. So
Yeah.
it wasn't
There was no
centralized.
means of moving U.S. currency throughout the Union, right? They had no means of doing it. That's what a bank does. You ever think what a bank does? In the old days, every state had their own currency, right? But now you have one currency and banks in every single state. Marshall basically said, listen, guys, right? If we go back to where the states can destroy the federal bank, we'll be right back where we started from. We're right back in the Articles without a structure of a federal government. and basically we'll have such a weak nation that we can't persist. He says this is a constitution to endure for the ages. And he says, never forget this is a constitution we're interpreting, right? He's flexible. It's like, you know, as much as I like to say, this is not gospel. This is not scripture. We have a government that needs to work first and foremost. Marshall, above all else, was trying to say, how can we interpret this document to make it work the most? Let's give necessary to mean convenient, right? Let's prevent the states from taxing the federal banks. Otherwise, we'll be in a very, very difficult situation. Okay. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry. Don't you think that there's still a gray area when you look at it that way? Well, I won't say convenient, because convenient in the Constitution, but even if you say necessary and proper, there's still some level on the continuum where it's not necessary, it's just so convenient that, you know, we like it.
Mm-hmm.
And so how does that balance out with everything that's going on? It's almost like saying, well, if it's necessary and proper, it still fits in the Constitution, but it still has this.
Does Marshall seem to put any limits on necessary and proper? One at a time.
Well, according to the way also interpreted it, as long as it's not something that's
Crazy.
prohibited.
Yeah. As long as it's not absolutely insane, they can do it. And Marshall's lesson would hold for 200 years. As long as what Congress is doing is not absolutely insane, they can do it. And what you'll see in this class in the next few weeks is an expansion of this power to say they can do basically anything that's not insane. Quickly, yeah.
If he doesn't interpret it this way, then you have taxation without representation, because Maryland is simply charging every taxpaying individual.
Is that in the Constitution or taxation without representation?
He lived through that time frame. So he's using.
He was incorporating whatever principles and values he had to his judgment. Okay? Yes.
This would be real quick, but I mean, I just think if the fathers, when they were there drafting the Constitution, if they found it so important to establish a post office, wouldn't they have also found it very important to establish?
That's what Madison said.
And then to go along with the clause right above necessary and proper, the Congress has the authority to set up the District of Columbia, or where, I mean, they didn't have that in mind, I guess, specifically yet, but wouldn't they really only have power to establish a bank within the district and not outside of the?
Potentially, yeah. All right, last question.
Going off what Michelle was talking about, in order to keep a military, you need a banking system, you need a way to get money from the populace, and we just came out of a war with Britain in 1815, and these were still times we weren't sure if we were still going to exist or not.
Yeah.
So I think if you put it in that perspective, that we just got invaded, and we need money.
And you need to spread the money throughout the union, also through the bank network. Okay, right. So what did McCulloch call, right? What is the ultimate holding of this case, right? So long as what Congress is trying to do is not prohibited, if it relates to a power in the Constitution, if it's convenient, Congress can do it, right? Congress can do what they need to get done so long as it's convenient for a power in the Constitution. And the courts will not second guess when Congress takes these actions. All right, so in Youngstown, the entire question is whether the executive has the power to do something. McCulloch is, does Congress have the power to act? And much of the rest of the semester, we asked the same questions. Did the executive have the power? And did Congress have the power? Okay. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening. I'll see you all on Wednesday.